Hey ocean travelers around the world. This is RMS Titanic, the unsinkable night that shocked the world. One ship, one calm night, and a cascade of small decisions that rewrote maritime history. The clock showed late evening. The sea lay smooth as polished stone, and the North Atlantic sky seemed almost friendly. Two lookouts in a small open platform near the very front of a great ship scanned the horizon. They had no binoculars that night, only sharp eyes and routine. The air felt cold and clean, the kind of cold that nips lightly at the nose and ears. A distant bell in the engine spaces murmured with the steady rhythm of a ship that believed itself secure. Everything sounded ordinary, everything looked ordinary, and then, in less than a minute, the ordinary became the reason people still whisper the ship's name in museums and classrooms around the world. At approximately 11:39 p.m., a shape began to form ahead. Dark upon dark, a patch of nothing where the horizon should have been. The lookout on duty reacted by striking the warning bell 3 times, a code that meant danger ahead, and he lifted the telephone to the bridge. The message delivered up the line was simple and urgent. Iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, the officer of the watch ordered the helm over and signaled changes in the engine telegraphs. The intention was to swing the bow away and slow the tremendous momentum carried by steel, steam, and pride. The ship responded, but slowly. Great vessels have great habits. For a few heartbeats, a solution seemed possible. And then the cold edge of ice met steel along the starboard side, with a rasping, tearing sound that some felt only as a shiver underfoot. It was not a head-on blow. It was a long, scraping kiss that bruised the hull over several compartments. On deck, some passengers paused with a polite curiosity, wondering if the ship had nudged a wave. Below, a trickle of seawater became a voice, and the voice became the first number in an unstoppable equation. Watch out for this. The moments from first sighting to first contact lasted roughly the span of a short breath, about 37 seconds. That is less time than it takes to tie a shoelace, and far less time than it takes for a giant ship to change its fate. The rudder bit into the sea, the engines faltered and reversed, but the iceberg's underwater shelf had already done its work, popping rivets, bending plates, making narrow wounds that let the ocean in, where the ship most needed to be dry. On promenade decks, the sound felt odd rather than scary, like a distant chain dropped on a metal floor. In a few first-class cabins, a faint vibration made a glass chime on a shelf. In the mailroom and the forward compartments, sailors and postal clerks met the Atlantic face-to-face. They saw water so clear it looked like clean glass in a basin, and they began moving sacks of mail upward out of habit and hope. The ship was still level. The lights still glowed. Nothing looked like a disaster yet, but experts on board would soon look at a list of flooded spaces and say words that carried more weight than fear. She cannot stay afloat. Before the bridge fully grasped the spread of the damage, the ship's designers and officers needed numbers. How many compartments, how far aft, and how high the bulkheads? The ship's chief designer, a quiet professional who knew the vessel like a patient knows a heartbeat, began a calm walk with the captain and officers, opening doors, observing waterlines, listening to the faucet sound of the ocean, now running where no faucet had ever been installed. In the first minutes after impact, he spoke not in exclamation but in measurements. The sea was entering forward spaces in too many places at once. Bulkheads between those spaces rose to a certain height, and in a calm analysis, he explained that once the water filled past that height, it would spill like a fountain into the next compartment, and the next, creeping aft like a set of steps. The ship could float with a few forward compartments flooded. That was part of the safety plan, but the damage now covered too many. 5 compartments were open to the sea. By the ship's design, 4 was at the edge of survivable. 5 was a line cross. Step by step, the officers did what they had trained to do. The watertight doors had already been closed by the officer on watch at impact. Crew were mustered. Some passengers were asked to put on warm clothes and life belts. more as precaution than alarm. The engines were balanced to keep power flowing for light and heat. The radio room, called the Marconi Shack for its equipment, came alive with signals stamped in rhythm across the night. The ship sent the day's most important code, a distress call. At first, the older code CQD went out, a clear message asking all stations to pay attention and assist if possible. Alongside it, almost as demonstration of practice and in full seriousness, the radio operator also sent the newer code S. Ships at sea many miles away heard, questioned, and answered. One passenger steamer turned hard to close the distance. Another vessel, closer but not listening, lay silent under stars. Quick fact: most of the first outward signs to passengers were gentle, not dramatic. In corridors, stewards tapped on doors and spoke with courtesy. On open decks, a few invited people to dress warmly and come outside for a few minutes. Some passengers laughed at the idea of abandoning a brand new ship built like a skyscraper on its side. A few tucked their tickets and keepsakes into pockets. Many who had come aboard with a sense of confidence still felt that confidence. After all, the ship floated level and the band would later play on deck. But mathematics has a calm voice too. The designer's calculation moved quietly through the command chain, and the captain, an experienced sailor near the end of a long career, gave an order whose logic would shape every life on board. Prepare the lifeboats. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with ocean stories whenever you want. Lifeboats hung from davits like cradles. There were more than any ship had been required to carry, under rules of the time, but not enough to hold everyone on board at once. Those rules were based on ship size by tonnage, not on the total number of people. They dated from an era when vessels were smaller, and rescue by a nearby ship was considered the second half of the safety plan. In fairness to the past, many believed that a ship like this would remain afloat long enough for help to arrive. This was not a careless hope. It was a policy made from experience and numbers, just numbers from a different class of ship. Tonight, those numbers were too small. On the boat deck, officers divided responsibility by sides and station. Orders were straightforward: women and children first, interpreted differently depending on which side of the ship a person found themselves. On one side, boat seats went to women and children primarily, with a few men to help row. On the other side, the rule tightened to keep men back, unless needed to fill the crew. This difference in interpretation is a detail that explains differences later seen in survival figures, without accusing any single person of cruelty. The rule's spirit was chivalry. Its impact was mixed. As boats began to lower, new lessons arrived, minute by minute. The ship was still nearly level, and seemed huge and safe, even to those standing in a small wooden craft, swinging down a white-painted wall. Some passengers hesitated. Some officers hesitated too, uncertain about weight limits and the strength of davits. Early boats went down with many empty seats, a choice that would be second-guessed for generations, not because people were unkind, but because people were human in a new kind of emergency. It is helpful to speak plainly here. Drills had been minimal, and no one on board had practiced filling every boat to the edge of capacity in close quarters at night. When people step into a small boat that dangles above the sea, they do not calculate perfectly. They fear the rope, the distance, the unknown. They look up at warmth and electric light and look down at cold darkness. Many chose to remain aboard a little longer, believing there would be another chance. In the wireless room, the key clicked ceaselessly. The operator on duty, a skilled professional, still quite young, worked through fatigue and the ache that radiates from long hours at a bench. He sent positions, updated other ships with short bursts, and fielded questions from land stations that treated the ship as a busy post office during the day. The messages moved across the night like small birds. Some flew to the right place. Some became fluttering confusion. The nearest responding ship set full speed, even going beyond what its boilers normally endured in peacetime service. Its captain, awakened from sleep, gave crisp orders, extra lookouts, extra steam, hot drinks prepared, blankets collected, medics alerted, lifeboats readied to be pulled back aboard once filled. Standing on the bridge, he understood the plan: reach the position, find small boats, and bring people into warmth. The sea between the two ships was not empty. Patches of scattered ice drifted like chalk marks, but the rescue ship threaded them carefully, lights shining, course steady. Back aboard the great liner, hours had not yet passed. The time from collision to the first boat's lowering was short enough that many did not understand the pace. Some passengers brought little, others brought a lot. Crewmen had to persuade, guide, direct, and sometimes gently insist. A few companionways were crowded, others were empty. Signs and barriers meant to separate classes in ordinary times led to confusion in these unusual minutes. Contrary to some exaggerated tales, most crew did not lock people away. They tried their best to guide them through a complicated plan for a situation that had never been rehearsed with the entire ship alive around them. The results varied by corridor and by person. In the quieter lower spaces, the sea continued its step-by-step climb. Quick fact: on clear glassy nights, an iceberg can be harder to spot because there are no breaking waves at its base to make a white line. On moonlit nights, ice can shine like a hill. That night carried stars, but no moon. The ocean looked like ink, and the iceberg sides only hinted at their outline. Even expert eyes can lose the horizon when the sky and sea match in color and texture. The design of the ship had included watertight doors, heavy steel partitions that could close, sealing off sections. These performed as intended after impact, limiting the flow of water vertically through the ship's interior. But the idea that a ship is unsinkable lives or dies on how many holes are open and where the dividing walls stop. Each bulkhead had a top. They did not extend all the way up like tubes. When water fills one space and rises high enough, it simply pours over and begins filling the next. It is not a flood like a waterfall. Think of water sliding across steps in a garden. Once it begins, the process continues quietly and steadily unless something interrupts it. That night, nothing could catch the water in a higher bucket. On the deck where the band gathered, music kept the air gentle. The musicians played familiar tunes, the kind that give order to the mind. Passengers walking by heard melody and saw officers at work, and judged, reasonably in the moment, that the situation must be stable. Children in warm coats watched the deck lights hum. Friendships formed in small groups. People reassured one another because reassurance is a skill. Communities share. Down below, in the area where coal had been shoveled day and night to feed enormous boilers, men worked as long as there was steam to manage. Their labor kept electricity flowing, and with electricity came light, warmth, and the ability to send messages. Their work was a bridge for everyone else. The lifeboat sequence, stretching roughly from just after midnight to around 1:40 a.m., was a long hour in which decisions matured. On one side of the ship, an officer grew more confident and began to load boats heavier, reassured by successful lowerings. On the other side, caution remained strong just a little longer. A few boats left with more seats than one might wish. A few later ones left very full. Some boats drifted away quickly, others lingered nearby. A handful returned toward the end to pick up people from the water. Human choices varied widely, but not because people were villains. They were sailors and passengers in a situation no one preferred, filing into small wooden answers as a giant steel question slowly tipped toward the sea. A word about the ship's movement. In the first hour, the ship's list was modest. As more forward spaces filled, the bow settled, and the stern lifted. The deck angle that began almost invisibly would become a slope. Walking became climbing. Doors wanted to swing shut against gravity. Water, always patient, began to show on the promenade level in quiet, reflective sheets that slid forward and drained away again with each tiny shift. The air grew colder as the night wore on, the kind of cold that pinches lungs and makes fingertips throb. Ship's rockets, white starbursts, meant to attract attention, rose up and faded like short-lived constellations. Back at the radio, the nearest silent ship did not respond because its operator had gone off duty and the set had been turned off for the night. That was normal practice at the time. 24-hour radio watch was not yet a rule. Men on that ship's deck saw lights and flares from afar and interpreted them through ordinary expectations, perhaps a company signal, perhaps a minor matter. Duty officers discussed, looked, and disagreed about what they were seeing. Ice lay between the two ships, and that ice, flat and reflective, can play tricks with distance. Even on land, people misjudge ranges at night. At sea, without trees or houses to scale the view, estimations become guesswork. Later inquiries would study these sightings carefully and write conclusions that remain debated. But one fact stands steady: a ship with radio off did not come, and a ship with radio on ran hard to get there. As time moved toward 40 a.m., the ship's lights still burned, and the band, in some accounts, continued to offer gentle songs. People were still launching small plans. One more trip back to a cabin, one more hug, a last set of instructions to a friend in a different boat. Officers gathered remaining crew and approached the collapsible boats stored flat on deck. These boats required quick hands to release and set. They were not the simple kind that already hung in swings. Every minute gained mattered. The sea now had a stronger voice up front. It hissed and slapped and moved objects that had not moved for days. In certain companionways, a crackle like rain announced the presence of freezing spray. In the last half hour, the deck angle steepened. Now the body understood what the eyes had not wanted to see. The ship leaned and bowed. The stern rose. A deep, mechanical noise rolled through the hull as items inside shifted. The final wireless messages repeated positions and urgency. Crew called for calm and order. One officer released a pistol into the night, not to harm but to get attention when voice could not carry across the wind and noise. There is no need to heighten this moment. It was already difficult, and the people in it behaved in a wide range of brave, ordinary, and imperfect ways. Many helped one another. A few argued. Most tried to think clearly. That is how people are. Modern analysis has long examined whether the ship broke at the surface or upon reaching the sea floor. Evidence favors a breaking on the surface as the stresses at the midsection grew too great for steel and rivets made for normal weather, not for angles like a mountain road. The bow, weighed down, dropped away. The stern, briefly relieved, settled back and then lifted again. The sounds of breaking metal are not loud like thunder in an open night. They are more like the groan and shriek of a barn door scraped across stone, magnified by size and distance. Those who were there described them as deep and strange. After the break, the two large sections began separate journeys to the bottom, leaving a wide trail of debris that would one day help explorers map the sequence like detectives reading footprints in snow. When the ship finally slipped fully under, the sea restored its level surface quickly. Lifeboats, at a distance, saw only a horizon that had changed shape. The noises that followed were brief, and then very quiet. The ocean, at night, is a master of silence. Within minutes, the rescue ship, still racing to the scene, had positions, hopes, and nothing visible but darkness and faint flashes where rockets had been. It is important now to take a calm look at numbers, not to turn people into statistics, but to understand patterns that lead to better safety. Survival rates differed by class, age, and sex, as is often discussed, but sampling matters. Some areas of the ship had easier paths to boats. Some were closer to certain officers with certain interpretations of orders. Some felt language barriers. While 3 general classes existed, each deck held different physical routes with stairways that helped or hindered. Children had higher survival rates overall, though not uniformly so, and women had higher rates than men, especially in areas where women and children first was strictly interpreted. Crew survival varied widely by job. Those in the radio room, the engine spaces, and the forward compartments were at greater risk because their posts were far from the boats, and their duty kept them there. These patterns are not moral judgments. They are maps of a night. There is also a small question worth handling gently. The phrase "third class locked away" has often been repeated with certainty. The truth is more nuanced. In ordinary times, physical barriers and signs separated spaces to help manage traffic and prevent crowding. During the emergency, some of these barriers made movement confusing. Some stewards delayed groups, expecting to wait for orders. Others led people up promptly. In short, some third-class passengers reached boats quickly, while others did not. This mixed reality is seen clearly by comparing lists of survivors and reading testimony. The lesson that emerges is not a simple accusation. It is a design lesson about routes and guidance. After this disaster, ships changed how they thought about moving large numbers of people to safety, with clear, simple paths, and with drills that teach those paths. While the large ship fought for time, the rescue ship made its own kind of race. Its captain, a man named Arthur Rostron, issued orders with the rhythm of a metronome. Extra lookouts stationed forward. Steam rerouted to the engines. Lifeboats swung out ready for retrieval. Hot drinks prepared in every galley. Blankets and clothing gathered. Doctors and nurses assigned to stations. The crew dimmed shipboard lights, where needed to avoid blinding those on watch, and kept others bright to show a target to small boats. The course bent through patches of ice that looked like low islands. The ship's vibration changed as the engines pushed harder. It was a careful hurry, the kind that seafarers understand, going fast, but not outrunning the ability to see. At around 4 a.m., lifeboats began to be sighted. Imagine that view. A small shape, low to the water, with a collection of exhausted faces, looking up at a high, warm wall. Lines dropped. People were brought aboard one by one. Some wept quietly. Some stared with that distant look that exhaustion gives. Hot drinks with sugar warmed hands and thoughts. Names began to be recorded. A roll call of survivors that would later become a memorial for those absent. The rescue ship's crew did not ask for stories. They focused on blankets and seats and careful steps. Dawn arrived, and with it the realization of just how empty the horizon was where a great ship had been. Back along that horizon lay the ship that had seen signals, but did not come. To its officers' credit, they later engaged with investigations openly. They described what they had seen, rockets rising, but interpreted as not necessarily distress, a large ship that appeared to not move, and ice in between that made the judgment harder. Later inquiries in both the United States and Britain studied bearings, times, and witness statements. The conclusions remain a subject of debate among historians and mariners alike. Some believe the ship could have reached the scene in time. Others point to ice, distance, and uncertainty. The most important change that came from this debate was not a verdict of guilt or innocence, but a new standard. Ships would henceforth keep a continuous radio watch. That single change has saved lives far beyond one night. With survivors on board, the rescue ship turned toward port. Wireless messages went out ahead, carrying lists of names. Crowds in cities read newspapers pinned to boards, watched telegraph offices for updates, and listened to the talk that always grows around large events. Families asked after loved ones. Reporters gathered facts and, sometimes, guesses. In ships' cabins, people tried sleep. A few survivors carried small objects saved from the night: a letter, a ring, a child's toy. Most carried nothing but the memory of a deck underfoot and a small boat under stars. To understand how a night like this occurred, it helps to step back from story and look at engineering. The ship belonged to a class designed for comfort and reliability. Its hull plates were fastened by rivets in the bow and stern, and by larger steel plates in the midsection. Its compartments were separated by bulkheads equipped with watertight doors that could be closed quickly. Its propulsion came from two large reciprocating engines turning side screws, and a turbine driving a central screw, a combination that provided a good balance of efficiency and speed for the time. The ship was not built to race across the Atlantic. It was built to carry people in comfort and safety at a solid pace. In a contest with a glancing iceberg, The steel and rivets performed like materials of their day. Later laboratory tests would examine how those materials behave at low temperatures and under bending stress. Results show a mixture of strengths and weaknesses. Some rivets in forward sections were wrought iron with more impurities than modern steel. Some plates were brittle when very cold. But it is easy to be unfair to old technology with modern standards. For 1912, the ship was advanced. The iceberg did not care about standards. Watch out for this. A ship's ability to turn depends on speed and rudder size. Slowing a ship reduces the water flow over the rudder and can make turning slower in the first seconds. The officer that night had to choose between several less than perfect options in a few heartbeats. Keep speed to swing, slow to reduce impact, or some combination. Analysis later showed that even a perfect choice might not have kept the ship entirely safe once the iceberg had entered the picture at such a short range. This is not an excuse. It is an acknowledgement of the geometry of a very big problem, meeting a very small amount of time. The belief in Unsinkable deserves its own calm moment. In the months leading up to the voyage, newspapers and promotional materials praised the ship's safety features. Some language from shipbuilders and company officials spoke of practical unsinkability, meaning that the ship could survive certain accidents. Public imagination and press enthusiasm rounded that cautious phrase into something absolute. No ship is truly unsinkable if enough compartments are open to the sea, and the ship's designers knew that. But hope is a persuasive writer, and people reading bright brochures in peacetime wanted to believe that technology had finally ended the old fear. The night retaught a lesson learned by sailors for centuries. Humility beats certainty on the open ocean. As lifeboats and survivors moved toward port, the world began to organize its response. Inquiries in the United States and Britain convened quickly. Witnesses gave testimony under oath. Radio logs and debt plans were pored over. Questions were asked not to blame individuals but to find uses for grief. Within a few years, a new international agreement took shape. Safety of life at sea, often called SOLAS. Among other rules, it mandated that ships carry enough lifeboat capacity for all aboard, practice boat drills, maintain a continuous radio watch, and slow or alter course in reported ice. The International Ice Patrol began tracking every season's ice movement from Greenland down into shipping lanes, giving mariners maps and warnings that had never existed in such organized form. These changes did not turn the sea into a lake, but they made the lake more like a well-lit harbor. Back to the night itself, and to small identities that deserve remembrance. The wireless operators, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, stayed at their post even as conditions worsened. One later recalled his colleague, urging him to save himself when the water rose around their ankles. In the boiler rooms, trimmers and firemen kept steam balanced, a job as vital as any that evening. On the boat deck, officers made hard calls without the benefit of hindsight. The ship's doctor moved where needed, carrying the quiet authority medical professionals hold in chaos. Stewards shepherded families and carried children. The band's choice to continue playing, while sometimes romanticized, served a real purpose. It kept crowd nerves steady and gave people a sense of time and rhythm when clocks had lost meaning. Step by step, the ship's story slid from present to past. In 1912, newspapers made front pages with black bars at the top, wrote long lists of names, and published sketches of the ship tilting under stars. Memorial services in cities around the world helped families who had no graves. Charities raised funds for widows and children. Writers tried to explain the unexplainable in poems and sermons. Early filmmakers made short newsreels using models and guesses, the way early cinema always did. The world absorbed the ship, not only as a lost vessel, but as a lesson pinned to the wall, visible every time a person bought a ticket for a future voyage. Years turned into decades. Ships grew safer, radios grew stronger, satellite navigation and weather forecasts shrank the ocean's surprises. Yet the wreck itself remained unseen for a long time, lying in darkness under 2.5 miles of water. The pressure there is immense, like the weight of several buildings pressing on a single fingertip. In 1985, an expedition found the wreck. The discovery was not an accident. It was the result of careful planning, new technology, and patient searching. Explorers located the debris field first, a carpet of objects scattered along the seabed, and then followed it to the two main sections. The bow, dug into the seafloor like the nose of a sled in snow, and the stern broken and twisted by forces no one on the surface had ever witnessed directly. Lights swept across steel that had not seen light since 1912. Plates, railings, a huge anchor chain and staircases wore the slow, steady signature of deep time. Modern mapping techniques, including photogrammetry, later allowed teams to create precise models of the wreck, measuring distances between fragments and matching them to deck plans, preserved in archives. This made a new kind of timeline. Not just what witnesses said, but what the wreck itself testified. The angle of a fallen mast spoke to the direction of a tearing force. The scatter of coal told of where bunkers ruptured. The way the stern's decks had pancaked showed how air and water fought in those final seconds. None of this was made to argue with survivors. It was made to complement them, to offer physics and geometry, where memory, after years, can soften or sharpen certain edges. Artifacts raised from the site taught small human lessons. A watch stopped at a certain minute reminds that time is both a number and a feeling. A china plate with a company logo says that ordinary objects have stories. Shoes found together make viewers think of the people who wore them. Their steps on a sunny promenade, 4 days out from land. Their laughter, their plans. Metal pieces helped metallurgists test how rivets and plates fail in cold. Letters once dried and preserved by careful conservators gave families words from those who had never returned. Museums today display these items with respect, making the wreck not a treasure chest but a classroom. Science revisited the night with models. Engineers built computer simulations of flooding patterns, checking how quickly compartments would fill with the sizes and shapes known from the ship's blueprints. Naval architects used structural models to see at what angles and loads a hull like that would break. The results, while technical, can be translated into simple images. Water climbs, weight shifts, materials bend. Something gives. Simulations comparing different orders on the bridge, maintaining speed for a better turn or slowing earlier, show that options existed, but that none were magic. In some scenarios, the ship might have survived with damaged plates and a long limp to port. In others, it still faced sinking, but with more time for rescue. These exercises are not blame, they are the way safety advances, by looking at the full tree of what-ifs and choosing branches that are stronger next time. A brief look at other maritime disasters gives perspective without turning the story into a contest of sorrows. The Empress of Ireland in 1914, the Lusitania in 1915, the Morro Castle in 1934, the Andrea Doria in 1956, and the Estonia in 1994. Each carried their own lessons: flooding through open spaces, fire, collision, listing that made launching boats hard. These themes appear and repeat. Each time investigators asked what could be improved in training, design, and regulation. The great liner's story sits among them, not as the largest or the only, but as the one that became a worldwide symbol. Symbols are useful when they lead to actions. In this case, they did. The iceberg's journey itself is a calm science lesson worth enjoying for a moment. Ice breaks from glaciers in Greenland and moves south with a cold current, slowly melting and changing shape. The part seen above water is only a small fraction. Most of the mass sits below the surface like a mountain root. On its way south, an iceberg rotates, loses pieces, and gains strange angles. At the latitude where ships cross between Europe and North America, spring and early summer bring more ice. On calm nights, the sea around an iceberg can look like glass. On windy nights, waves break and make it easier to spot. That night was one of those polished nights, beautiful for a stroll on deck, difficult for a lookout on duty. How language around Unsinkable took hold is also a useful gentle point. The company did not print the word in giant letters on every wall, but people around the industry, writers and promoters, used phrases that sat nearby. Practically unsinkable conveyed confidence in the design's compartment system. Headlines turned that into pure certainty. This is a familiar human pattern in many fields. A careful statement walks into a crowded room, and a bold version walks out. After the disaster, the bold version lay shattered, and the careful version became an important caution against overpromising what technology can do. Consider the economics and social setting of 1912. For a moment, the Atlantic was a busy highway. People traveled to take up new lives, to work, to visit, to return home. Shipping lines competed the way airlines do today, offering speed, comfort, and reliability. One line focused on record-breaking voyages, another on quiet luxury and dependable schedules. The great liner belonged to the latter strategy. First-class spaces resembled fine hotels. Second-class cabins offered solid comfort. Third-class rooms, while plain, were a significant improvement over the steerage of earlier decades, with better ventilation, brighter spaces, and food served in dining rooms, rather than carried in pails. The ship was a floating city. It carried families of all incomes and ages, from infants to grandparents, from workers to famous names who had filled society columns. That variety is why this story travels easily into hearts. People see themselves somewhere on those decks. Now a set of short, clear debunks helps the mind rest. The ship did not strike one long gash from bow to stern. Rather, it suffered a series of openings along the starboard side, small individually but serious as a group. The ship was not racing to break a record. It was moving at a normal speed, for a ship trying to make a scheduled arrival, in conditions it believed manageable. Binoculars missing from the lookout did not by themselves cause the collision. Binoculars help long-range identification. They are less useful at night when contrast is poor. A few gates and doors did cause delay for some third-class passengers, but systematic locking away was not the main pattern. Finally, the sea that night was not a stormy stage. It was calm, which made spotting ice harder and lowering boats easier. These simple truths correct the myths without removing wonder. Profiles in duty and decision give the story faces. Captain Edward Smith had planned to retire soon. He carried the calm manner of a man who had seen many crossings and storms. First Officer William Murdoch, on the bridge, made snap decisions that others would debate for a century. He had seconds, and he used them. Second Officer Charles Lideller interpreted evacuation orders very strictly, a choice that shaped who entered boats on his side. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, walked quietly, offering assessments without drama. Officers like Joseph Boxhall took bearings, sounded spaces, and launched boats. Wireless men, Bride and Phillips, worked until water reached their feet. On the rescue ship, Captain Rostron's leadership stood like a lighthouse. These names are not the only ones, but they are anchors in the mind. Passenger microhistories bring an ocean of faces into clearer focus. A young Irish woman, traveling to join family in America, standing with a shawl and a small trunk. A Swedish family, parents and children, sharing a simple cabin and practicing English phrases. A wealthy American couple, who had traveled the world, now standing shoulder to shoulder in ordinary coats. A ship's baker staying aboard to pass out loaves to people in boats, his body later warmed by work and by something stronger. Crew stewards, who had worked on liners for years, now finding themselves as guides to lifeboat seats. These small scenes are not decoration, they are the texture of history. When a historian says, "souls on board," the term is not poetic, it is precise. As the rescue ship steamed toward port with survivors, the world pondered the lessons already mentioned. Drills matter, lifeboat capacity must match people, radio must stay awake. But more subtle lessons also took root. Communication needs to be simple in emergencies. Signs must be clear, routes easy to follow. People naturally help one another if given calm direction. Training that includes real movement, putting on a life jacket, Finding a ladder sticks better than words alone, and perhaps the most important rule, stronger than any angle or bulkhead, attention to warnings. The sea that night had carried warnings via wireless earlier in the day. Ice reported in certain latitudes. They had been noted, posted, acknowledged, and then treated as general rather than immediate. Mariners, since then, have learned to treat such notes as more than paper. They are like voices calling from the next hill. Slow down, turn slightly, check twice. Before moving further, a brief quick fact that connects past and present. The International Ice Patrol, established after this disaster, still tracks the movement of icebergs each season, using aircraft, satellites, and reports from ships. The patrol's warnings, issued in charts and bulletins, have drastically reduced the risk of unexpected ice in busy shipping lanes. That is a quiet victory, one of those public services that most people never think about because it works so well that nothing dramatic happens. When museums and television documentaries speak about this night, they often end with solemn music and account of names. That is appropriate. But for a bedtime reflection, there is also room to notice calm, practical wisdom. The ship's crew kept power and lights far longer than might have been expected. The band offered rhythm, passengers took turns. Another ship made a dash in the dark that saved hundreds. Investigators and lawmakers turned loss into rules with teeth. Over a century, every ferry drill and every shipboard announcement saying where to muster is, in a small way, a candle lit in that memory. The wreck today continues to change. Bacteria in deep water feed on iron and make delicate, lace-like structures that look like stalactites, only fragile. These rusticles show that steel, even in cold darkness, is part of a living cycle. Storms at the surface do not trouble the wreck at depth, but currents do, and the slow rain of silt and marine snow settles in a fine layer over everything. When cameras visit, their lights awaken colors that no human eye has seen unsuited to darkness since 1912. Soft reds of paint, pale greens where copper lies, creamy whites of china. Then the lights go off, and the ship returns to night. There is a temptation in any famous disaster to chase new mysteries. This script chooses calm over thrill. There is enough wonder in the facts. A ship thought safe met ice. Officers made decisions under pressure. People helped one another. Another ship came. The world learned. The lesson that breathes from 1912 to now is not fear. It is respect. Respect the sea. Respect warnings. Respect the physics of big machines. And respect people's ability to take care of each other when care is most needed. The conversation about whether the ship should have struck the iceberg head-on rather than turn has also earned a place in polite debate. A head-on collision might have crushed the bow, but kept the number of flooded compartments below the fatal threshold. But here is a practical truth. No officer on any bridge is trained to aim at danger when an apparent path exists to avoid it. The instinct is to steer away, to soften a blow, to make a near miss. Training since then emphasizes speed reductions and wider safety margins, not courageous gambles. This is how safety culture grows, by improving the options so that good instincts also produce good outcomes. As the rescue ship reached port, newsreel cameras recorded its arrival. Crowds, as crowds do, filled piers and streets. Some waited with hope, some with the quiet that means the mind is bracing. Officials helped with identification and lodging. For survivors, the first night on land must have felt unreal. Soft mattresses, stationary floors, warm lamps, and the knowledge that friends were missing. In the days that followed, letters and telegrams crossed the ocean in both directions. People wrote not the words of legends, but the ordinary language of relief and sorrow. Safe, missing, arriving Thursday. Those documents survive in archives and family boxes, holding emotions that need no narrator to explain them. The ship's place in the migration era is also worth a quiet nod. Thousands of people each year used liners to begin new lives. Tickets represented courage, savings, and decisions made at kitchen tables. The ship's third-class spaces, better than older steerage in ventilation and cleanliness, symbolized a promise that ordinary families could cross an ocean with some dignity. That promise did not die with this one voyage. Other ships, armed with new rules, kept carrying that dream. The Atlantic highway remained open, and people kept traveling toward hopes as real as any harbor light. A final set of reflections gathers the night into a message that fits on one page, in a school book, and in one heart before sleep. Many small factors align to create a tragedy. Limited lifeboat capacity by old rules. A calm night that hid ice. A short warning time. A design that could not survive 5 flooded compartments. A nearby ship not listening to radio. Human hesitations when stepping into small boats. And the ocean's timeless patience. Against these stood other factors that saved lives. The rapid work of crew. The endurance of engine room teams. The discipline of officers. The rescue ship's sprint through ice. The band's steadying music. And the reforms that followed. The balance of these pieces created both the loss and the legacy. The sea in the North Atlantic remains cold. Stars still hang above empty water on clear nights. Ships still pass in the dark. But each ship now carries a world of wisdom in its metal. And in its crew's training, wisdom paid for by those who faced a silent iceberg under a friendly sky. That is how the story belongs to the future. Not as a ghost tale, but as a guide. The rescue ship's log for that early morning reads like a finely tuned checklist, performed in fast motion. The captain ordered extra hands on the bridge, then directed engineers to divert steam from heating to the engine. He asked every galley to prepare hot broth and coffee, placed medical staff at the forward gangways, and instructed crew to gather blankets, spare coats, and dry shoes. Deck lights stayed on as beacons, but glare was reduced along the bow to protect the eyes of those scanning for low boats. The North Atlantic remained glassy, a deceptive calm that made small shapes blend with the sea. The ship advanced through patches of white ice that resembled low, flat islands. On the open decks, sailors stood by with heaving lines coiled in neat circles at their feet, ready to throw. Out on the dark water, the lifeboats rode low, wood creaking quietly, oars clacking in locks, as volunteers established a rowing rhythm. The boat's numbers painted on bows and sterns were ordinary in daylight and suddenly vital now. Some held a mix of women, children, and crew. Some carried a few men who had been asked to help with the oars. Some contained more seats than people because of early caution. The sea's hush was the quiet of a stage between scenes. A few boats stayed near one another for comfort and to share oars, while others drifted apart. In one, a junior officer tried to sort people by strength and seat them evenly to keep the boat balanced. In another, a passenger with previous rowing experience coordinated strokes, counting softly to keep pace. Pull, rest, pull, rest. On the cold horizon, a first glow suggested dawn might not be far. In the faint light, one lifeboat held a figure who had become a symbol in later retellings. A Denver woman whose quick thinking, insistence on rowing, and encouragement kept spirits steady. Her name would later be described in headlines with the resilient nickname Unsinkable, a label she never asked for but accepted as a reminder to keep moving. In other boats, equally determined people spoke less and rowed more, passing around a single flask saved from a cabin or tucking a sleeping child under an extra shawl. A boatswain's call sometimes peeped across the water. 2 notes, practical and clear. Close to dawn, the rescue ship's lookouts spotted the first boat. The ship eased engines to avoid throwing a wake that might unsettle the small craft. Lines were thrown down. Passengers came up one by one or two by two. Young first when possible, those least steady supported at elbows by sailors with quick, practiced hands. Names were asked and written. There is a moving simplicity to those lists. Last name, first name, age if known, nationality if obvious from an accent, and any relation, a husband still at sea, a child at the mother's side. A single traveling companion. Blankets appeared as if from nowhere. Then hats and mittens. Then hot mugs that steamed clouds into cold air. Back on the sea where the ship had vanished, two collapsible boats told their own harsh stories. One, known as A, had been floated off the deck edge and was swamped to the thwarts. People clung to its sides and tried to keep water out with hands and hats. Another, known as B, had overturned during launching and now served as an improvised raft. Men balanced on its curved bottom, knees bent, trying to keep it steady. An officer known for strict discipline refused to allow too many newcomers onto that precarious platform, fearing one shift would pitch everyone into the sea. A wireless operator clung there too, feet numb, listening for voices and looking for a proper boat to draw near. It did, eventually, and he was pulled aboard, lying in a heap at the bottom as feeling pricked cruelly back into his legs. On the subject of the nearby ship that did not respond in time, it is helpful to speak calmly and plainly. Its wireless operator had gone off duty and turned off the set for rest. On its bridge and forward decks, officers and crew saw lights, a ship that appeared stopped, and rockets in the sky. At sea, rockets can mean many things: celebration, signals between vessels, or distress. The color and sequence matter, but at night, through layers of cold air and with ice fields between, certainty can drain from even experienced eyes. That ship's captain and officers later gave testimony about what they saw and why they judged as they did. The debate that followed produced less heat than change. The rulebook grew a new firm requirement: ships must maintain a continuous radio watch and treat rockets at sea as warnings demanding response, not riddles to be solved later. Numbers tell a quiet truth about the night's outcomes. Roughly 2,200 people began the voyage. About 700 survived. These figures, rounded for clarity, place the human scale in view, without reducing individuals to arithmetic. Survival rates varied by deck and by interpretation of women and children first. On one side of the ship, men were refused seats even if places remained. On the other, some men were allowed to help when boats needed strength at oars. Young children fared better overall than older adults, though several elderly passengers survived, thanks to early guidance or determined stewards. Crew survival hinged on duty station wireless operators, and engine room men faced heavier odds than deckhands near the boats. The pattern is sobering but understandable. Where people stood and what jobs they held shaped their seconds of choice. Consider the lifeboat sequence more closely, because it teaches how an emergency matures from confusion to competence. Boat 7, often noted as the first launched, left with many open spaces due to caution and disbelief. Boat 5 followed with better loading. Boat 6 went down the port side with a seasoned seaman guiding the tiller. In it rode a woman who would become famous for organizing and speaking up. Boat 1, an emergency cutter near the captain's bridge, lowered with very few aboard, a decision criticized later not for malice, but for extreme caution about strength and swing. By the time Boat 14 left under an officer known for energy and a measured voice, the ship's crew had gained confidence in the davits and ropes. That officer later gathered several boats together and even transferred passengers between them to send a slightly emptier one back into the field to search for people in the water. Such returns were rare and risky in darkness. His became a small, bright point in the map of the night. As for the collapsibles, they illustrate the value of drills. These special boats required quick assembly. Canvas sides pulled up, wooden slats locked, and thwarts set in place. When minutes are few and hands are cold, even simple tasks require experience. Crew managed to free two. One slid into the water swamped. Another drifted off, overturned. Later, daylight and steadier boats turned those precarious shapes into lifelines by moving people from them to safer craft. The lesson is gentle, but firm. Practice matters most when time is shortest. The band's contribution remains one of the night's most human notes. Musicians stood on deck and offered tunes that were not dirges but familiar, steady, and hopeful. "Nearer, My God, to Thee" has been often named, though accounts differ on whether it was indeed the last piece played. What is certain is that music kept minds organized. In crowds, rhythm becomes a shared heartbeat, On many ships since, officers have noted how even a short, calm announcement, just a voice, not music, can serve the same purpose. It builds trust, lowers panic, and gives the mind a thread to follow. Now the engineering story deepens. The ship's watertight compartments were a response to an earlier era's shipwrecks, a strong idea, implemented with the limits of the time. Each compartment could be closed off by heavy doors, actuated from the bridge or locally by hand. The idea was not faulty, it was merely not enough for this particular wound pattern. The bulkheads rose high, but not to the very top decks. Designers balanced weight, cost, and interior layout. If a blow opened 2 or 3 forward spaces, the ship would live. Even possibly 4, 5 turned the bow into a set of steps for the sea to climb. The vertical doors slowed the flow. They did not eliminate it. In this way, the design met the standard it promised, but faced a problem beyond its promise. That is not an excuse. It is an important distinction that shaped all future designs. Materials research conducted long after the event found that some forward rivets contained slag, impurities from wrought iron production, that made them slightly more brittle at low temperatures. Steel plates themselves behaved within expectations for their era. But like all steel, they lost some toughness when cold. Nothing in these findings suggests deliberate carelessness. They describe a 1912 ship meeting 1912. In later decades, steel making improved, testing regimes grew stricter, and design margins widened. The ocean rewarded those changes with calmer statistics. A short and helpful point about speed. The ship was moving briskly, but not recklessly, aiming to maintain a schedule many ships kept under similar conditions. Ice warnings had been received during the day and posted for officers. These reports identified a general area rather than a precise lane, much like notices a driver might receive about fog over several miles. That night's sea did not display the breaking wave cues that often warn of nearby ice. Several other ships passed through the region without incident. This is not to say the speed was ideal. It is to say it was not outside the norms of the time. Later norms shifted toward caution in ice seasons, and that shift represents progress rather than a tidy verdict about the past. The business story behind the voyage offers context without blame. Transatlantic lines competed fiercely for passengers. One, backed by government mail contracts and turbine technology, focused on speed records, making the crossing in days that newspapers printed in bold type. Another, which owned the ship at the center of this story, emphasized comfort and steadiness, building spaces that felt like grand hotels afloat. Interiors included a gymnasium, Turkish baths, a squash court, and palm deck lounges. Third-class accommodations, though simple, were an improvement over earlier versions of steerage. Bright dining rooms, better ventilation, cabins rather than crowded dormitories. Ticket prices spanned a broad spectrum. A traveling family might spend the savings of a lifetime on passage. A banker might treat the voyage as a routine commute. Everyone stepped onto the same decks to feel ocean wind. When the ship was new, mock trials of lifeboats and safety features took place, but comprehensive, full ship drills did not occur with passengers aboard at sea. On that Sunday, a boat drill reportedly planned for the afternoon did not take place. Such decisions felt ordinary at the time, and would later feel unthinkable. Today, even small ferries require drills before departure. Life jacket demonstrations, muster points, clear signage. The difference between then and now is not courage, it is culture. Moving back to the rescue, the boarding process continued hour by hour. Survivors entered the rescue ship's care in waves. First a few boats, then more as the search widened. Crew checked the sea with binoculars, and with bare eyes, sweeping slowly to catch any small low lines that might be the gunwale of a boat. By 8:30 a.m., new boats stopped appearing. A broad circle had been searched. The rescue ship's captain held a short service for those lost at sea, a quiet acknowledgement that the search had shifted from rescue to recovery, and that the living needed transport and care. The ship turned for port. Life aboard the rescue vessel during the return was a lesson in organized kindness. The purser's office became a hub for lists, messages, and papers. Cabins were shared to give families privacy. The saloon, designed for elegant meals, served as a place for warm soup and bread. Crew offered spare uniforms to men without clothes, shawls to women with damp coats, and wool socks to children. Visitors from the press waited on shore. The captain kept them at a respectful distance until the ship docked, and officials could manage identification properly. Even in sorrow, procedure matters. It prevents additional harm. On land, news spread in bursts. Newspaper extras, their ink not fully dry, hit the streets with headlines in letters as tall as a thumb. In cities far from the ocean, people gathered around bulletin boards outside telegraph offices, scanning columns of names to find a friend, a cousin, a business partner. Philanthropic groups organized funds. Churches and synagogues held services. A few families received telegrams that simply read "safe," and those single words became precious family heirlooms, saved in drawers and brought out to show grandchildren decades later. Others received no message at all and knew in that silence the shape of their loss. The official inquiries in the United States and Britain produced thousands of pages of testimony. The American investigation convened quickly, calling passengers, crew, designers, and company officials to speak under oath. The British inquiry convened soon after, took a more technical approach, studying ship plans, construction methods, and the precise sequence of events. From these studies emerged the practical mandates repeated ever since. Ships must carry lifeboat capacity for all aboard. Boats must be kept ready and drills held. Radio rooms must be staffed around the clock. Ice reports must inform course and speed, and officers must treat rockets and unusual lights at sea as potential distress. Every safety briefing on modern ships and aircraft echoes those lessons. Know the exits, know the equipment, practice before it is needed. It is also fair to address quietly the behavior of a company official on board who entered a lifeboat. His presence in a boat became a point of moral debate. Some harsh judgments followed in the press, while others offered more sympathetic readings given the chaos. Without turning the story into a trial, one can say this: leadership is observed most closely in moments when examples are needed. The culture that grew out of 1912 made that expectation explicit. Today, training for crew and corporate officers emphasizes accountability and service in emergencies, with strict frameworks for who leaves last and why. A deeper look at statistics helps sweep away myths. The idea that the ship's crew locked third-class passengers behind iron gates as a matter of policy does not fit the full testimony record. There were gates and signs for crowd management. Some were closed briefly, some were opened promptly. Some stewards waited for orders or tried to direct people to specific routes that would be safer once the upper decks grew crowded. Language barriers and unfamiliar layouts added delay. The outcome was tragic for many third-class passengers, not because of cruelty alone, but because the system was not designed for a sudden full evacuation. Modern ship design now hardwires evacuation into corridors and signage, making the safe route obvious and keeping doors open when alarms sound. The iceberg's own story adds a contemplative note. Born from the snout of a Greenland glacier, the ice had calved into the sea months before, drifted into the cold southbound current, and slowly rotated as underwater shape and melt changed its balance. It had endured storms and sun, and perhaps the rough kisses of other bergs in a crowded field. By the fateful night, it had likely softened and developed shelves underwater that extended further than its clean white crown suggested. Those shelves are the dangerous hands that reach under a ship's waterline. Had a wave been breaking, the outline would have been easier to spot on a calm night. It blended with sky. Sailors know this, which is why ice seasons now command such respect. The wreck's discovery in 1985 turned a story told with words into one shown with images. The team that found it used a towed camera sled, scanning long lines back and forth over the seabed, like mowing a lawn in darkness. When the camera first revealed a boiler, a circular, multi-eyed iron face, It announced the presence of the ship without ambiguity. The bow appeared next, stern later, the field of debris between them telling a path of descent. Explorers found a railing bent like a paperclip, a whistle lying in silt, and a massive chain coiled like a sleeping serpent. Remote vehicles later entered spaces no diver could, showing the grand staircase reduced to outlines and shadows, the roof long gone. The ship that had once glowed with light now wore the somber colors of the deep gray olive rust. The sea had not destroyed it. It had absorbed it. From that discovery onward, debates rose about salvage, preservation, and the ethics of visiting. Some expeditions raised objects for conservation and museum display. Others argued that the site should remain untouched. A maritime grave, international agreements developed to manage activity around the wreck, encouraging research and respectful conduct. In museums, a simple object, such as a letter opener or a hatpin, becomes a bridge across time. People look at these objects and say quietly, "Someone held this." That is history's great strength, transforming vast events into touchable story. Science, drawing on wreck mapping and contemporary testimony, refined the timeline of the break. Engineers noted how air trapped in the stern would have compressed as it sank, then burst out as structure failed, shattering decks and scattering furniture. The bow, heavy with water, had dived more cleanly, plowing into the seafloor and burying itself. Over time, microbes, iron-eating bacteria, built draperies that from a distance looked like coral. These structures, though delicate, grow daily, so the wreck that visitors see now is not the same shape explorers saw decades ago. The ship still changes, slowly, following rules that do not care about fame. The inquiries also set straight several persistent myths. The ship's speed was ordinary for its type in gulls. The lights of the nearby ship were real, but misinterpreted, with ice and optical effects complicating judgment. The idea of a single clean gash was set aside in favor of a series of openings along seams and plates. The suggestion that doors were locked to trap people was replaced by a more complicated and more humane picture of confusion, partial barriers and overcrowded routes. Myths thrive in strong emotion. Facts thrive in patient study. This story has room for both emotion and study, but it rests finally on the latter. Comparisons with other incidents underline recurring patterns. In 1914, a collision in fog sent a Canadian liner down rapidly on a cold river, with casualties matching the terrible speed of flooding. In 1934, a fire off the New Jersey coast took another ship by surprise, and lifeboat launching in a heavy list proved hard. In 1956, a collision off Nantucket left two famous liners locked for hours, yet most aboard were saved due to better communications and rescue coordination. In 1994, a ferry in the Baltic suffered bow door failure and capsized quickly, again showing how water on car decks behaves like a ferocious cargo. Each event led to niche improvements, better watertight integrity, stricter loading rules, clearer evacuation signage, and more decisive go-slow protocols in risk zones. The 1912 disaster sits at the start of this chain as the most famous teacher. What-if scenarios can be considered without turning history into a game. If the ship had met the iceberg head-on, damage might have been concentrated forward, flooding fewer compartments. If speed had been reduced at twilight, the rudder might have caught more water at a critical moment, or the ship might have had more minutes to stop before reaching the field. If binoculars had been in the lookout's hands, perhaps an earlier sighting would have led to a wider berth. But if the sea had not been so calm, launching boats would have been harder and more dangerous. If the nearby ship had maintained radio watch, rescue time might have shortened. Each hypothetical carries a hidden cost or benefit, and none offer a simple rewrite. They do, however, draw a map of improvements that later generations actually made. Slower speeds in warning zones, better lookout protocols, mandatory radio watches, and lifeboat capacity for all. Leadership profiles deepen understanding of the night. The captain, Edward Smith. carried decades of experience and a reputation for calm. His decisions, once he understood the extent of damage, aimed at time, keep power, keep lights, launch boats in an orderly way, send messages, try everything reasonable. First Officer William Murdoch, faced with the iceberg in seconds, gave helm and engine orders that reflected standard training. Second Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted women and children first, as women and children only, unless seats remained, a strictest born of personal conviction about order under stress. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall took bearings and plotted positions by star and habit. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe gathered boats and performed that risky but valuable return to look for survivors in the water. Thomas Andrews, the designer, spoke plainly about flood progression, never dramatizing, always advised. On the rescue ship, Captain Arthur Rostron's decisive sprint through ice set a standard often quoted in seamanship manuals. Crew roles deserve equal attention. Firemen and trimmers in the stokeholds kept steam balanced, shoveling coal in hot, close spaces while the ship grew cold above. Stewards walked corridors, knocking politely, helping with jackets and lifebelts, and guiding people upward. The master-at-arms and the purser helped maintain order. The carpenter checked the hull, reporting where water appeared first. The postal clerks labored in the mailroom, hauling sacks to higher decks by instinct. To save the government's trust, the band played. The wireless men tapped out code. As long as keys worked, each small duty became a fiber in a rope that held until it could not. Passenger microhistories expanded, bring balance to the technical. A young Finnish woman, ticket clutched, faced decisions in a language she had only begun to learn. A newly married couple from England, traveling in second class, saw a future in a New York neighborhood, and spoke of renting a small room near a bakery. A Syrian family, part of a wave from the Levant, rode in third class and counted heads carefully to keep together in the corridors. A poet from France, traveling with notebooks and hope, paced a deck and wrote a line in memory just a day before the collision. A child in a sailor suit ran between chairs on the promenade that morning, then slept through much of the night's confusion bundled in a coat. These snapshots add weight to statistics. They make the ocean a place where individual stories move, not just an abstract blue field on a map. After the inquiries, safety reforms rippled outward. The new Convention on Safety of Life at Sea required regular drills and the presence of enough lifeboats for everyone. Muster lists became formal documents, not informal ideas. Officers practiced with rockets and lamps to send unambiguous distress signals and to interpret those seen. The International Ice Patrol began its seasonal flights and ship reports, mapping where bergs traveled and broadcasting warnings daily. Radio rooms became 24-hour operations. Later they evolved into modern communication centers with satellite links, but the principle remained the same. The sea does not sleep, so ships should not sleep either. Education also changed. Nautical schools taught case studies, not just formulas. Cadets read about this night in detail, learning not to gawk, but to understand. Bridge resource management evolved. A culture where senior officers invite input from juniors, where checklists matter, where fatigue is recognized as a hazard. Those ideas would prevent accidents in aviation and medicine as well. One night in 1912 helped rewrite how teams think across many fields. When museums curate exhibitions, curators choose the order of display with care. Begin with the human, move through the technical, end with lessons and remembrance. Visitors walk out, understanding why the event matters. The feeling is not fear, it is thoughtful respect. That is the right note for bedtime. As well, the ocean is vast, but not unknowable. Ships are complex, but not capricious. People are fallible, and also generous. Put together, these truths make a sea that can be crossed with wisdom. Returning briefly to misconceptions, it is useful to address the idea that crew fired wildly into crowds, or that violence was common. Testimony does not support that. There were tense moments and in one case, warning shots fired to command attention near boats. But widespread violence was not the pattern. Officers and crew maintained general order with voices, whistles, and hand gestures, and passengers cooperated far more often than they panicked. Panic is a word used too easily by observers. Most people, most of the time, follow instructions and help neighbors when guidance is calm. On the technical side, the ship's triple screw arrangement shaped its handling that night. The two outer screws were driven by reciprocating engines, the center by a turbine that engaged at higher speeds with exhaust steam. When engines were ordered reversed, the turbine could not run backward. Its propeller effectively stopped. Some analysts later argued that this reduced water flow across the rudder and turned a fast swing into a slower one. The point is not to second-guess an officer who had seconds to decide, but to understand machinery's behavior in crisis. Designers since then have modeled such interactions in simulators, giving bridge teams a feel for how ships answer the helm under different engine commands. Cargo and mail added their own quiet notes. The ship carried mail sacks, labeled with official seals, to be delivered across the Atlantic. In the first flooding minutes, postal clerks, dedicated federal employees, did what mail carriers have long done: protected the mail. Their work likely cost them precious time to reach the boat deck. The ship also carried cargo, foodstuffs, personal trunks, and company goods. Claims later sorted out who had lost what, but the human weight of those items, a wedding dress, a violin, a set of tools for a new life, far exceeded their itemized value. Now to return to the central experience of the night. As the bow dipped and the stern rose, water's movement across decks made new rivers where carpets had been, brass railings chilled under palms. The fluting of wind through rigging lines made a thin, reedy music that the band's strong, warm instruments answered with melody. People stood, then sat, then stood again as the slope increased. Gravity rearranged the furniture and the mind. In that hour, decisions became clear. Some helped others into boats and then stepped back. Some officers held to the idea of sequence and fairness, even as time ran short. In that hour, humans looked very much like themselves: brave, afraid, practical, hopeful. The final lessons from 1912 extend into daily life, far from the sea. They encourage attention to warnings, practice before need, communication that is simple and honest, and humility about technology's limits. They suggest that systems should be designed so that the right thing is the easy thing. Doors open towards safety, signs point clearly, essential equipment is obvious and usable. They remind that leadership is service under pressure, and that skill is a gift best prepared in quiet times. And so the ocean night that began with stars and calm water ends in memory with reforms and resolve. The ship's name has become more than a noun. It is a shorthand for hubris corrected by humility, for tragedy transformed into care. Over a century later, ships crossing the same waters carry lifeboats enough for all, practice musters, keep continuous watch, and slow for ice. Passengers stand at rails and feel a soft wind on their faces, unaware that a web of rules and habits nurtures their peace. That ignorance is not a failure. It is a success. Safety when working is invisible. A last quiet scene completes this part of the story. In a museum gallery, a child stops in front of a glass case holding a small pair of shoes. An adult reads the label softly. No special effects, no loud music, just a conversation and a moment of silence. The child looks up and asks a simple question: did people help each other? The answer, spoken by a guide with a warm voice: yes, many did, and because they did, many others learned how to help. Since the child nods, looks once more at the shoes, and walks on, carrying a piece of that night into a future where ships and people remain. The gallery quiet spreads into another scene, one that explains why the ship carried the initials RMS before its name. Those letters stood for Royal Mail Ship, a designation granted to vessels entrusted with carrying the mail. It signaled punctuality, reliability, and special fittings aboard. A mail room staffed by trained clerks, sorting racks, sealed pouches, and secure chutes. Mail contracts added steady income to passenger fares, the way cargo and air mail supported airlines later. On this voyage, dozens of bags bore stamps from countries on both sides of the Atlantic, each sack a small promise between distant hands. The ship's postal clerks, working in a bright forward room, knew the rhythm of that promise. When water appeared at their feet, they did not cry out. They reached for bags. That habit, protect the trust, remains one of the night's clearest portraits of duty. Duty also explains why lights glowed far into the small hours. In the boiler rooms and stokeholds, men shoveled coal and adjusted dampers so that dynamos could keep turning and the ship could keep breathing. Electric light, pumps, telegraphs, and radio. Their world was a furnace chamber, with steel plates overhead and valves singing with pressure. The contrast between that heat and the cold above made the ship feel like two planets joined by ladders. They kept at it until there was no at it left to keep. To every warm bulb in every corridor, and to every coded dot and dash sent into the night, those men were the invisible circuit. On deck, even order had a sound. A whistle trill drew attention to a lifeboat station. A boatswain's hoarse voice called for hands on the falls. An officer's steady instruction set. The pace step here. Hold there, sit now. People learned quickly that a life jacket, cinched high and snug, sounded like canvas rubbing canvas when two neighbors turned to speak. They also learned that a wooden thwart bit cold through a wool skirt, and that breath made small clouds that lingered and then vanished, as if the air itself were listening. Unfussy details like these explain why for many survivors the memory of that night resembled a series of clear postcards rather than a single sweeping panorama. A postcard from the wireless room would show the key in motion. The older distress signal, CQD, went first, because it was the one most operators had used for years. All stations, distress. The newer signal, SOS, soon followed. A rhythm of 3 shorts, 3 longs, 3 shorts that was not a word at all. Only a pattern that carried better through static. Ships at ranges hard to imagine by land. Tens of miles, hundreds in some cases listened and replied. Shore stations listened too, and telegraph companies passed along what they heard like runners handing batons. The story of that night's messages is not one station. It is a network learning line by line how to be a safety net. The sea that received those signals is not an empty stage. It is a system. Cold Labrador current meets warm Gulf Stream, and their mingling creates fogs, eddies, and weather that can turn gentle or stern in hours. Ice floats south each spring and early summer, sometimes as solitary white hills, sometimes as fields. A glassy sea, praised by poets, is a lookout's headache. Broken waves around bergs help the human eye sketch outlines. No moon made it worse. With no lunar glow, the deepest blacks and faintest grays meet without a seam, and the skyline becomes an erased line. That is why the lookout's bell 3 urgent clangs, and the telephone voice mattered. They were the moment when sight and system collided. People often ask, why not more lifeboats? The short, honest answer, because rules at the time measured boats by ship tonnage, not by the number of people aboard. The ship in question actually exceeded requirements. A fact that makes modern listeners stiffen, because it reveals how swiftly safety standards can fall behind technology. When ships were smaller, rescue was expected to be a relay, boats to keep people near the ship while another vessel arrived. As liners grew, the relay time stretched, but the rules stayed the same. After 1912, that math changed decisively. Capacity for all, drills before and during the voyage, and equipment kept ready without debate. Averages and patterns help explain outcomes, but the night also wrote exceptions in careful ink. A few elderly passengers survived, thanks to guides who insisted they come early. A few young, strong swimmers did not, because cold water punished confidence and rewarded insulation, time, and luck. Some crew in high-risk posts made it because tasks drew them upward at a critical minute. Others were faithful to posts that gave no upward path. Threads of language and geography are visible too. Clusters of friends and cousins traveling together tried to stay together, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. It is tempting to search these patterns for a neat rule. The sea resists neat rules. It offers trends, and then introduces a person who refuses to be a trend. There is value in pausing over 5 or 6 names and letting them stand for the hundreds. A steward named Violet, experienced and calm, worked boats on the port side, and later wrote about the feel of a rope burning through gloves when a boat descended too quickly. A baker named Charles moved like a small supply ship, handing out bread and convincing a few to take boats by turning the choice into simple errands. You there, take this, hold that, sit here. A wireless operator named Harold found himself atop an overturned collapsible, sharing space with others in a choreography of balance, where a wrong shift sent 4 or 5 into the sea at once. A bandleader named Wallace selected tunes that kept timing steady and spirits useful. An officer named Lowe counted, combined and returned, a triangle of motions between safety and risk. A captain named Rostron on a distant bridge rewired his ship in minutes, turning dining rooms into clinics and lounges into linen closets. 6 names can stand for 600, because each reminds that systems function only through people who act. The nearby ship question deserves clarity without heat. Men on its decks saw rockets, but misread their meaning. Officers debated whether they were company signals and whether a great liner would truly be in distress on such a calm night. Ice between the 2 ships distorted appearances and distances. The wireless set was off. All of these facts push in one direction. A mischance born of ordinary practices that were no longer good enough. The remedy, written into law and into habit, was simple and stern. Stay on watch by radio at all hours. Treat rockets at sea as distress, unless proved otherwise, and err toward action. That remedy echoes now in the drone of 21st century electronics that never sleep. Unsinkable became a word the world tasted for years afterward. First bitterly, then warily. It had not come from a single boast. It had grown from brochures that celebrated watertight compartments, from articles that praised modern shipbuilding, and from a public hungry for proof that technology could domesticate nature. The 1912 night showed that compartments and doors and pumps are not magic. They are tools with limits. That lesson traveled beyond ships. Bridge builders, airplane designers, and hospital administrators all learned to write about safety with modesty and precision. A quiet sentence matters. This system greatly reduces risk. Not this system eliminates risk. Like many great events, the story joined culture at once. Sermons spoke of duty and class, and equality. Before the sea, poets wrote lines about stars reflected in black water. Sheet music appeared in shop windows. Some pieces solemn, some surprisingly jaunty, because popular culture is a mirror with many angles. Charity concerts raised money for families. Memorials went up in cities and small towns. A bronze figure, gazing seaward, a plaque in a post office, a name carved into stone that weather will soften, but not erase. The ocean lingers in these materials. Stand near bronze after rain and it smells faintly like ships. The 1985 discovery gave the world images to match stories. First came wide shots of the bow's proud curve, now humbled into silt. Then details, scrollwork, a capstan, a lantern bracket still bolted in place. Film lights in deep water behave like little suns, spilling white in a tight cone and shading out to blue, then black. Inside that cone, dust motes hang like stars. The stern looked like a storm, frozen in iron. Decks curled back, machinery exposed in a confusion whose logic only engineers could read. Between the 2 sections lay a drift of belongings and fittings, a bat's porcelain side, a suitcase latch, a child's marble. Each object obeyed physics on the way down. Heavy fell first, light sailed longer, and together they drew a map of descent. Raising artifacts brought conservation science to the foreground. Salt-laden water infiltrates leather and wood. and metal. When an object comes into air after decades in brine, it can fall apart in hours if not treated. Conservators rinsed gently, replaced salt with fresh, stabilized fibers, and coaxed metals into long, slow drying. The process can take years. The reward is the preservation of something that, once on display, acts as a hinge for memory. A pocket watch stopped at a particular minute does not prove an exact timeline. Watches stop oddly, but it invites viewers to measure their own day against a vanished one. A pair of spectacles speaks of reading on a quiet afternoon in a deck chair. Sea wind as a bookmark. Photogrammetry, a method that builds exact 3D shapes from thousands of overlapping photographs, made a new kind of witness. With it, researchers could measure gaps to the inch, track changes over seasons, and compare models to deck plans stored in archives. The angle of a broken mast matched a hypothesis about when and how the break occurred. The direction a staircase fell hinted at the sequence of compartment flooding. None of this replaced testimony. It partnered with it. If a survivor remembered a tilt a certain way, and the map showed a movement that made that tilt likely, the two together earned trust. The what-if discussions, done carefully, are a workshop, not a courtroom. Head-on collision versus glancing blow. Head-on might have crushed a smaller area and left the number of flooded compartments under the fatal line. But the helmsman and officer had seconds, not a laboratory. Slower speed in late evening. Slower might have given more time to turn, but might also have changed how the rudder bit. More lifeboats loaded early to capacity. That would have raised survival greatly, but only if drills and culture made passengers eager to step into small boats hanging 30 feet above dark water. The point of rehearsing these is not to edit history, it is to improve the next decision someone faces on a bridge, a runway, or a hospital ward. Statistics, gently handled, continue to guide. Survival skewed toward those near exits, boat decks and open promenades, and toward those encouraged early by stewards and officers. Gender and age patterns reflected the women and children first guidance. Though not uniformly across both sides of the ship, crew roles predicted outcomes. Deck crew fared better than engine room crew. Radio men faced grave risk by staying with equipment. Postal clerks in forward spaces faced long odds. Language and deck plans mattered. Signs now are brighter, pictograms more universal, and drills include multi-language announcements for exactly this reason. The list of misconceptions is shorter when told as straight corrections. The ship did not tear open along a single continuous gash. It opened in several places along seams and plates. It was not setting speed records. It was keeping a respectable schedule. Binoculars would have helped mostly by day, and even at night, not as much as many imagine on a moonless glass calm sea. Third-class passengers were not systematically trapped behind locked gates. Some barriers existed and caused delay, but many were led upward, and confusion, not design, was the larger enemy. Officers did not fire into crowds. A pistol was used for warning in a specific case to assert order at a boat, and order was largely maintained by voice and presence. Such corrections make the story less sensational and more useful. Across the Atlantic world, the migration era continued after 1912, but with added wisdom. Families still packed trunks, and bought tickets, and wrote addresses for cousins in New York or Montreal on folded paper. Ships still sailed, but vessels carried more boats. Radio rooms hummed without pause, and ice patrols sent daily maps. Harbor pilots stepped aboard with a new respect for checklists. Safety became a habit, not a special event. Habit, in safety, is the highest art. A modern officer, trained with simulators that replay famous cases, learns to feel the weight of a big ship through a virtual helm. The screen shows black water, moonlit or not, and a pale blur ahead. Rudder commands become muscle memory. Engine orders roll off the tongue. Voices in the simulator, juniors and seniors alike, practice speaking up, repeating back, confirming and challenging when needed. That too is part of the legacy. psychological safety on the bridge, so that one person's doubt can become the whole team's caution. The oceanographer's perspective rounds out the lessons. Satellite records track the annual parade of bergs. Ocean buoys report temperature and current. Aircraft overfly the pack and mark positions. When late spring brings a stronger than average flow, charts wear heavier clusters of symbols and shipping lanes, adjust like rivers finding new paths around sandbars. In a good season, berg counts drop to dozens. In a hard season, they rise to hundreds. Pilots and captains treat those charts as living documents. The ritual of checking them each morning on a crossing is a quiet homage to 1912. A glance at a map that says simply, "We know more now." At sea level, passenger experience reflects these improvements in unnoticed ways. Muster stations are printed on boarding cards. Safety videos play automatically in cabins. Crews stand by with brightly colored vests during drills, smiling and pointing. Children are given small bracelets with cabin numbers. All of this is choreography to music that most do not hear. The melody runs like this. If trouble comes, people will already have walked the path once, already have pictured the door they must find, already have held the clasp of a life jacket and tightened it. Practice makes calm. Media and memory have, over the decades, balanced the story between awe and understanding. Films dramatized, books analyzed, museum exhibits combined artifacts with survivor voices and engineering models. Classrooms used the event to teach buoyancy and leadership, probability and ethics. Tour guides on modern ships point to the horizon and mention ice patrols with a tone that is both matter-of-fact and reverent. The name of the ship has become a shorthand in languages far from English, a way to say this was preventable or this taught us something. Words do that. They shrink complexity into a token. Good teaching stretches the token back out into the full shape of truth. At the wreck site, ongoing change urges patience. Bacteria eat iron, salt seeps, and gravity continues its slow pull. Eventually the bow will slump, and the stern's jagged towers will settle. This is not loss. It is nature receiving back what industry borrowed. Responsible visitation focuses now on recording high-resolution scans, careful transects, and environmental measurements, so that when the site becomes less recognizable, the record remains richly detailed. Future students will be able to step through a digital model and say, "Here, this beam, this hatch," as if they had visited in person. One more pass through the night sequence brings the story home. A calm North Atlantic, star fields without a moon, ice warnings pinned near the bridge, a watch officer at his post, lookouts scanning with the sharpened vision of men who spend their lives at height. 37 seconds of warning, helm over, engines signaled, a long scrape instead of a crash. A designer's quiet math, boats readied, polite knocks on cabin doors, a band steadying tunes, two different interpretations of one rule on opposite sides of a deck. Rockets that climbed and fell like bright punctuation marks. No one fully understood. Radio that sang out for help. A ship that raced to answer. A ship that slept and did not. A final angle. A break. A silence. Boats on a flat sea. Dawn and rescue. Lists and blankets. Inquiries and reforms. The sea afterward. The same and not the same. From that sequence came a way of thinking. Consider the humbler phrasing safety experts prefer. Layers of protection. The ship had layers but not enough for that pattern of damage. Today, layers multiply. Design, training, equipment, regulation, culture. Each layer alone fails sometimes. Together they succeed more often than headlines admit. In that sense, the legacy is not only lifeboats and radio watches. It is the habit of adding one more layer and one more, quietly, until risks that once felt ordinary start to feel unfamiliar. When night settles, and a harbor grows calm, gulls tuck heads under wings, and the slap of small waves against pilings becomes a lullaby. Somewhere, some child asks an adult to tell the story of the great ship. The adult begins not with fear, but with facts shaped softly for sleep. A grand vessel, A quiet night, a meeting with ice, and many people who tried hard to help. The child asks, could it happen again? The adult answers, parts of it perhaps, which is why people work so carefully. And then, after a pause, and because they worked carefully, millions have crossed the same water safely. The names belong in that answer too, even if only a few are spoken aloud each time. A captain who accepted the math and turned it into action. Officers who launched, counted, returned. Musicians who played, firemen who fed furnaces, stewards who guided, wireless operators who hammered code into the dark, a rescuer who sprinted through ice, a child who kept a wool cap on and a grip around a parent's hand. Their choices turned a bad night into a lesson with edges, but no spikes. With lessons comes a kind of peace. It is not the peace of forgetting. It is the peace of understanding. The ocean does not promise safety. People promise it to one another and then work to keep that promise. Technology is part of that work, and so are laws, and so is training. But the heart of it is attention. Lookouts with eyes tuned to faint contrast. Officers who ask one more question. Crews who practice the boring parts until they are muscle memory. In the end, the great ship's story settles into a final paragraph that invites sleep. Many small factors aligned into tragedy. Many acts of care aligned into rescue. The world took notes and changed. Today, ships cross the same corridor under stars that look very much like those of 1912. Radios hum, ice charts update. Lifeboats hang ready and bright. Passengers stroll on deck, warmed by coats and conversation, not by knowledge of regulations. The sea remains itself wide, deep, and old, and people remain themselves curious, brave, sometimes slow to learn, and then very good at it. That is enough to close the book tonight. Gentle sign-off then. May those who were lost rest in remembered waters, and may those who travel now find calm seas, clear signals, and a safe harbor ahead.